In order for us to understand the concepts of interpersonal communication, we need to understand where one of those parties within that dyad, okay, those two people who are talking to each other, well, one of those parties is coming from. And typically that's our party, who we are. The whole concept of the self and what that means and what we bring to the table in terms of how we communicate or how we relate with what's going on. So there are a number of popular, and I use that maybe in a derogatory way, types of theories out there on the self, and I really don't ascribe to a whole lot of them. There's one that I'll put forward to you here with this presentation, and you should also watch the Johari window one as well, that gets into, I think, a better definition, one that I agree with more in terms of the self, that we are who we say we are. Our word is who we are in that respect. And I'll get into the word thing here in just a little bit later on as we talk about the Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. But to begin with, let me get into, I guess, some of the standard or the classic self-concept theory. And again, I want you to go through and illustrate this within your notes. And you can do so by drawing a triangle like this. And we're going to go through and name the 3 points of that triangle. And these 3 things represent the self. You are at the top. Yourself, obviously, is represented by who you are and what you bring to the table. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. What others think of you as well. And then what you think others think of you. And so this is the classic idea that the self-concept is made up of those 3 notions, that you are made up of who you think you are, who others think you are, and who you think others think you are. Okay, not to be too confusing, but it's a little weird, and you'll see why here as we get into this. So let's start with you in terms of who you are. And we could spend probably all semester in terms of making that kind of definition here. Most of us make that definition about what we think we see in ourselves, and obviously the mirror can be the apt metaphor for that. There's a problem with that, though, as it says right here, that we might find ourselves to be inadequate, not enough, based on socially constructed ideas of how we should be, how we should look, or how we should behave, or how we communicate, or the vocabulary that we use, the talents that we possess, or whatever. And that becomes kind of dangerous because once we set our expectations on those external influences that way, then we're no longer really ourselves that way. We're not really set up authentically. Some have argued that ourselves are based on our values. And that's interesting because most of us don't really know what those values are, or maybe I should say we don't own those values until a little later on in life, when we have those values tested on our own turf and not on somebody else's turf, not on our parents' turf or on our religious leaders' turf or on our coach's turf. We've had to test them out on our own. Okay, so and each one of these actually is where we subscribe to on some level. Ruiz, in the book The Four Agreements, argues that we're born into agreements, and values, beliefs, and attitudes are part of those that set of agreements that we're born into. I was certainly born into my parents' value of patriotism. Now, I own that value, okay, I'm a patriot as well, but it took me to have my own experience in terms of an American and the service to my country and so on to go through and arrive at that level. I've become even more so now that my kids are doing the same thing. So the values, that those ideas make up who we are. Certainly beliefs make up who we are. And for a lot of us, depending on the culture that we're in, we happen to live in southern Utah in a monotheistic culture, meaning there's really one major belief there that kind of overrides everything else. And you better believe that goes through and makes up who we think we are. But again, do we own that? Or are we still kind of borrowing from those influences that are around us? Lastly is this concept of attitudes. And if you look this up, you'll get into the good attitude, bad attitude kind of thing. But there are default attitudes that we all have that make us up, that make up who we are. And I won't go into a whole lot of detail here in my interpersonal class. I talk about automatic attitudinal defaults in my critical thinking and in my social media class. So if you want to know more about that, you certainly can go through and take a look there. I have a video up. Maybe I'll post that so you can go through and take a look at it if you want to. But my point here is your automatic attitudinal default, your assumption. If somebody comes in and says Barack Obama, or they say, what's his first name? President Trump, and you have a reaction to those terms, okay, that's an attitudinal default to that, whether they're good or bad, okay, and they make up who you are as well in terms of those attitudes. So I can go on in terms of our experiential set makes up who we are at the ages of 19 and 20 and 22 and so on. That's not a very broad or deep set in terms of experience. But nonetheless, we're trying to form and see what's going on. I would like to think that I know, well, I do. I know more about who I am now at the ripe age of 55 than I ever could ever conceive of at the age of 19. Even though I feel like I'm the same individual, I've come to learn myself better over the course of that existence. We have a perceptual set, not just the experiential set, but the perceptual set on how we have perceived things going on and how those perceptions have either been confirmed or they've been denied. And that hones our ability perhaps to go through and be more perceptive in drawing in that information that makes us up. All right, so that's the you side. Let's go to the others side and what that means. And this is interesting because the theory goes through and says we define ourselves, a third of how we define ourselves is based on other evaluations of us, other opinions of us. And for a lot of us, that means a lot. We don't necessarily go through and seek out what people think about us, but when they go through and say, hey, you seem like to be a pretty good student, well, we take that in, excuse me, and we can if we agree with it, we can go through and say, well, yeah, thank you, I think I am. I'm a hardworking student. Or we can go through and say, no, really, I'm kind of stupid, and you're wrong in your assessment of me. Okay, and that's what's kind of quirky about others' evaluations of ourselves, even though we completely glom onto them in terms of making up who we are. Oh, I see you as a modest, worthy young individual here. And again, we might agree with that, or we might not. We might go through and say, well, that's an expectation, and I try and reach that expectation, but I fail. So as a result of that, I don't feel very good about myself. Again, that's the trouble with others' expectations, is because we might not rise to that occasion. Okay, in fact, we might. This is not an evaluation. Okay, I put this here because here is this person who kind of marches to her own tune. I'm not saying that the one on the left doesn't march to her own tune either, but you get the idea. More of a rebel. And if somebody goes through and says, "Hey, it looks like you're a rebel. It looks like you are march to your own drum," kind of thing. It's an evaluation. It's a social opinion that comes out, and we accept these or we reject these in terms of who we think we are. The problem with, I've mentioned a lot of problems with this so far. One of the main issues that I have with the whole idea of social comparison is that we live in a society where everybody gets a T-ball trophy no matter what, right? And as a result, we're losing identity. We're losing the individualization along the way in terms of what we're doing to progress and grow and become the people that we are. I'm not saying that's a fault of being politically correct or being oversensitive or over-liberal or whatever. You might be surprised to find out what my makeup is later on. What I am saying is it's kind of dumbing us down in terms of who we think we are individually if we compare ourselves socially, and that can become problematic. All right, well, the last one of this triangle is this idea of supposition. And that's where we go through and we suppose what others might be thinking about us. And that's problematic because we don't know. And yet, the majority of us in our interaction with each other, especially in certain contexts, like in higher education or like in religious contexts or like at work, where we go through and think, oh, well, my boss doesn't like me very much, based on an assumption of maybe their nonverbals that come to us, only to find out that they were having a bad day, and we find out later on that they really do like us during our job evaluation, and they think we're doing an outstanding job with what's going on. That's the problem with supposition. We just don't know. We have no idea. And yet, I would say, like, these are divided into thirds, but I would say the majority of our self-concept is based on what we think other people think about us. And that's problematic. Well, the concept of this whole, the threefold idea, what you think of yourself, how others see you, and how you think others see you, making up the self-concept, is that the closer these corners are to each other, the more authentic we become. If we have agreement between who we are, who we think we are, and others' evaluation of who we are, there's some continuity of character going on there, right? There's some kind of authentic self, and we all gather around the campfire and sing Kumbaya and count unicorns. So along comes the Four Agreements, written by Don Miguel Ruiz. I've been studying this book for 15 years now. And after the first year, I decided to incorporate it into this class, into interpersonal communication. This is the book. You need to have this for this class. And you also need to have the Mastery of Love, also by the same author. And you can find that later on or somewhere else on Canvas as we get into this. It's on the syllabus. So the Four Agreements, and it sounds kind of, the book looks like a little kind of New Ages, ethereal, crystal ball kind of thing. It's not. It's, if it were, I probably wouldn't. I wouldn't have. It took me a while to get into this because I was put off by maybe that kind of nature with this, and that's why I'm talking about it now. But once I read the book, once I read the specific chapters that got into each agreement, I saw the practicality of each one of these and what they mean. Let me tell you about what those agreements are. The first one is to be impeccable with your word. And here, it gets into that kind of definition. Let me take that a little bit farther, as Ruiz does in the book. To be impeccable, impeccable means, by definition, without sin. And while that begs an ecclesiastical kind of conversation, I'm not talking about it in terms of worthiness, okay? To sin here, the opposite of being impeccable is to live in your sin, sinning against yourself. So, for example, if I've decided not to eat so much sugar, okay, and I want to go through and cut back on that, I've made that agreement that I don't want to go through and do that. But later on, I down a whole box full of Hostess cupcakes, then I've sinned against myself, okay? It's in that I've gone against myself. To be impeccable with my word is to not eat the box of Hostess cupcakes, right? Is to be consistent, is to have that integrity. Say only what you mean, as it indicates within this graphic. And we're going to come back to this impeccability here in a minute. The second agreement is to not take anything personally. I've looked at each one of these agreements and tried to go through and say which is the hardest, which is the easiest, and really I can't come to that conclusion. But for a lot of people, this is one that's really tough to get beyond because of that social comparison, right? That what other people think about us means so much. And so if we take that, we take it personally. Somebody goes through and says, wow, I think you're a pretty bright individual, and you go, oh well, thank you. Based on your input, I must be a pretty bright individual because I think you're pretty bright as well. So we buy into that, and that's good. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, other than they have now hooked our attention. So whatever else they might say, we might also buy into as well. Somebody comes along and says, wow, I think you're kind of stupid, and you go, well, maybe I am, if that's the way you see me. And if we buy into that, it goes through and confirms what's going on. We've taken that personally. On both this positive and negative evaluations that we're getting in that social comparison, if we take them personally, we've been hooked by that. If we don't take it personally, if we leave it for what it is, well, that's how you see me, and that's fine, but I'm going to go through and work on my own evaluation of how I see who I am, then we are no longer subject to what other people are going to do to us. It says here, when you're immune to the opinion and actions of others, you won't be the victim of needless suffering. And no truer words have I read than that. Okay, so be impeccable with your word. Don't take anything personally. Next is don't make assumptions. Ruiz says never assume. And that's a big deal too, because like we were talking about in terms of how we think other people think we are, that's entirely, supposition is based entirely on assumption. Imagine the power we might have in making the agreement to never make assumptions again, which forces us to ask questions. It forces us to be interpersonal. It forces us to be more communicative, to find out what's going on instead of just relying on assumption. Once you start practicing this as an agreement, you'll be amazed at how much assuming you've been doing. The last agreement is to always do your best. And Ruiz argues that your best changes. There's some days your best is better than other days, and I have to agree with that. We can get into all kinds of, again, social expectations as to what your best is, but I'm going to save that for another discussion that we'll get into here. So let me take these ideas of 4 agreements. Be impeccable with your word. Don't take anything personally. Never assume, and always do your best. And let's go back to that model. Okay, and let's start with this whole concept of supposition, and I'm hoping you'll see where this goes. So we've defined supposition then as assumption. So a third, okay, or I would say a majority of how we see ourselves really is based on assumption. And then if we look at the other side of the triangle with others, and we know that really what we're doing is taking whatever they say, we take that personally, okay? And if that's the foundation of our triangle of the self-concept, we don't have a very clear vision of who we are. So imagine what would happen if we made just 2 of those agreements. The first off, the agreement to never assume, and secondly, to not take things personally. The triangle goes away, and we are left simply with the agreement to be impeccable with who we are, to be impeccable with our word, because our word is who we are. What we say to other people, how we represent ourselves out there, both verbally and non-verbally, is who we are. You've had a conversation with somebody somewhere along the line, and over the course of that disclosure, you learn something about yourself. That's being impeccable. That's the integrity that we find within that self-disclosure. And then that last agreement comes along to always do your best. You don't need the 2 other legs of this triangle at this point in determining who you are. So I've provided you a theory, and I've kind of gone through and I've disproved the theory with this concept of the 4 agreements. What I could tell you is I could tell the folks who live by this. And and the difference this has made in my life has been absolutely extraordinary in terms of interpersonal communication, in terms of my relationships with my spouse, with my kids, with my friends, all across the board. So, like everything in this class, not only am I expecting you to understand this, there's also an expectation perhaps that you might adopt this. That'll happen in an assignment that's coming up called the personal contract, and we'll get into that a little bit later. If you have any questions, you know where to find me.